Good morning. I'm Greg Smith. I'm from Morrison Lowe, and I'm here today to talk to you about the rates harmonisation process and the presentation that I recently gave to councillors. So today we're going to talk about the rating background, the rates harmonisation process, the objectives, the requirements, constraints, and the opportunities, the service pricing and rates benefit analysis we've undertaken, and finally the rating structure options and the impact on ratepayers. So when you think about this, there's been really no change in the rating structure for the last 50 or probably 75 years, and that's largely been changed and evolved as a result of the community demands and the decisions of councils over the years. So the question is, I guess, is there a need to realign the rates and the fees and charges? And there is some argument to say that this is the opportunity. And as an example, we're suggesting that the ad valorem component, that is the rate in the dollar, might go towards funding the infrastructure. The fixed amount, that is the minimum charge or base amount, excuse me, might go towards providing the costs or covering the cost for the services provided. We need to think about the benefits that each of the rating categories get, and we will talk about that a little bit later in terms of rates paid and benefits received, and being mindful of the service pricing and the capacity to pay for individuals. This exercise is not just about the rating structure. Council's got a broader issue in terms of making sure they've got enough income to deliver all the services and infrastructure that they need to deliver, and at the same time manage and use the income they've got in an efficient way. The other challenge for merged councils is the service harmonisation, and generally across the merged councils that's varied from council to council. But what we have observed is that the service levels generally have gone up to the highest level from one of the participating councils. So what we need to be mindful of is that there's going to be potentially increasing cost as a result of those the change in service levels. And then we need to be looking at things like service pricing to see whether we can recover or whether council can recover greater money from the fees and charges as opposed to the rates. So in terms of the rates harmonisation objectives, there's two parts to it. One is you've got to develop an equitable rating structure that distributes the rates burden fairly across the new council area, but then that's going to be balanced with the need to reduce the extent of the impact or on the majority of ratepayers. And to some regards, that is a conflict. You've got a set of conflicting objectives. And from our work done to date, it's going to be a real challenge for council. Councils maintain their current rate yield. They don't lose or change that. And they also need to be aware of the IPART rating review that was undertaken for rates right across New South Wales. The requirements under the Local Government Act, it was amended so that the former councils couldn't alter their rates for 4 years. And upon reaching that 4-year mark, which initially was the 1st July 2020, councils had to then or harmonise their rating structures. As I said, the initial date was the 1st of July 2020, but now they've extended that, or councils can choose to extend that to the 1st July 2021. So, but the basic requirements of the Local Government Act is that there is an ad valorem component, which may consist of a minimum as well, or a base amount. And council makes those decisions based on the information they have in front of them. The fixed amounts, if you like, the minimums and the base amount, help smooth the distribution. And from our work to date, the base amount approach rather than the minimum does that more effectively, particularly in rural and regional councils. As I said earlier, the rates permissible income and calculations, that won't change. The amount of rates that council can charge will not change. And there is a new evaluation for all properties, which I believe you guys would have got. I've got mine recently, that then that councils must use for making their rates from the 1st of July 2021. There are a bunch of issues and constraints for this whole process. At the moment, as I mentioned earlier, there is an IPART review of the rating system. There were 42 recommendations. A number of those have been ruled out. We don't believe there'll be any decisions made before the 1st of July 2021, which means we've got to use the current legislation that's in place. I'll talk briefly about the submissions that were put in relation to that report, and I'll provide a high-level view of that. The constraints that council got is in terms of timing of the changes. It's you know, come the 1st of July, either 2020 or 21, the new structure's in place, and they've got limited options, and they're limited by the legislation that the council operates under. Some of the issues, the delay in the implementation, that is the harmonisation implementation, increases the correction gap. So the longer it goes, the bigger the gap it is that needs to be corrected. We need to be mindful, or councils need to be mindful, that the total rates notice amount, because in your case you've got general water, sewer and potentially stormwater. So they've got to be mindful of that. And the council elections are coming up, although I understand now that they've been maybe deferred until 2021. Regardless, it's something that councils need to be mindful of. I guess the summation of the IPART, the submissions to the IPART on their report, is best summarised in this sentence, where what is clear from the feedback received is that any change to the rating system will attract both applause and criticism. Every aspect of the system is contested and fraught with competing vested interest, ideas of fairness, and differing views regarding of technical application. Basically, there's pluses and minuses, and there's going to be a difficult path in terms of any adjustment to the current rating structure. There was one of the major issues was moving away from unimproved capital value in terms of how your rates are calculated to capital improved value. There's no clear consensus on that, and our view for rural New South Wales is that we would recommend you stay with the unimproved capital value. So in terms of our methodology, this is how we see it happening, is that we develop up a discussion paper, talk to councillors, making sure that they're clear about what the issues and challenges and things that need to be addressed are. We do some high-level analysis, which you'll see shortly, and we finalise the discussion paper with a clear project plan and action plan that needs to be undertaken. Then there's some pricing and revenue strategies analysis, rates benefit analysis. Then we undertake the detailed rates modelling, and out of that comes some options, which you will see a bit later, and then council makes a decision on which of those options they go to the community engage with. That's one of the key parts of this process. Once that's completed and it goes back to council, then council makes a decision about what the new rating structure is and what the new revenue policy is for the council going forward. These are just quickly the deliverables through that process, and we're talking to you about these ones down here: service planning, rates benefits model, and the ratepayer impact model. For councils, they've got some levers to use. We can talk about the split between residential and business, or residential and farmland, or farmland and business. It just depends on what's happening on the ground for councils. They can choose to move income between categories, but for our analysis, our two options analysis, we haven't done that. Councils can also use more or less subcategories. That helps deal with the differentiation of rates that are paid across those categories, and also to consider the affordability, or if you like, the service level. As we mentioned earlier, there is, in terms of the structure, there's a base amount, an ad valorem, or minimum and ad valorem. But with the base amount, council can only collect up to 50% of the rates income for that particular category or subcategory. So, so that's the limit on that, but it does smooth out the impact when you're trying to bring together a number of rating structures. Special rates is another area where councils can choose to use them for mainly capital works, but maybe they could be used for works and services. Councils can also assess and change the revenue streams, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And also they need to be very mindful of their concessions through pensioner rebates and the debt recovery policies they have in place. Now, in terms of revenue policy, there's obviously the key driver for council is financial sustainability. Have they got enough funds to deliver the infrastructure and service requirements of council? As I mentioned earlier, that's one of the key things that council needs to be mindful of. And then once that understand that expense, then what's the mix of rates and other sources of revenue that can actually fund the delivery of those services and infrastructures? When we come to rating principles, there's a bunch here, and the two key ones for us are equity, that balance between the benefit and the capacity to pay principle. Are the ratepayers getting the benefits equal to the amount of money that they're paying? And the other one is simplicity principle, is trying to make the rating structure simple so that everyone can understand it. But we also need to be considerate about efficiency. We need to be consistent with the policies of council. We've got to also think about the public good versus the private good in terms of how much council subsidises services they provide, and of course the intergenerational equity where people in the future, have got to be contributing towards the operation of council, and not all the present day ratepayers are paying for for example, all the infrastructure costs. Because we've done a lot of work with the majority of the councils, some of the key observations we've made are that councillors' involvement with the executive support is critical, and the reason for that is that councillors will need to make the ultimate decision, and so they need to be involved. They need to be on the journey through this process. So that's critical. So when it goes out, they'll be able to talk to the community. The community got questions, but then it's got to come back in after it's through the community consultation. They've got to make that final decision. There's a need to develop and communicate the rate structure methodology. So it's important that the council understands and communicates their approach to their new revised rating structure, because the fundamental, issue is that there's no silver bullet here. There's going to be, unfortunately, there's going to be some winners and losers through this process, and that's due to the constraints of the legislation that we've got to work within. There needs to be a clear and agreed project plan, and I mentioned that earlier, that comes as part of the early part of the work. And then once you start the project and you've got some momentum, you need to keep that going through council, through community, through the staff. And we've seen a couple of examples where councils have stopped for some good reasons, but then it takes a while to get that going again. So if all we can say is that once councils start, they should keep going. Strong staff participation and direction is important because we don't know all the nuances of your community. We don't know what's a priority, what's important on the ground. So staff help us in that space. And finally, there needs to be some really solid community engagement through this process, because at the end, the community have got to, understand, but they're the ones that got to live with it once council make that final decision. So we're talking about income. So this is the 2 years, 2019, 2018, and the breakup of council's general income. It doesn't include water or sewage, and it doesn't include any capital income. So you can see here that your rates represent 27% of your total general fund revenue. And down this end, you've got general operating grants and specific operating grants, which are reasonably high, which is pretty typical for a regional council. And then you've got fees and charges and annual charges in here. And I guess what I was saying earlier, if council could start to move these around a bit, it may have an impact on the amount of rates. Now, this is a high-level analysis. So thinking about the former council areas, so what this is showing is that, just need to come out of there, is that so what this is saying is that Murray Shire had 55% of the previous rates and Warcool 45% of the previous rates. Then in terms of land value of the former councils, Murray had 67% of the land value and Warcool 33% of the land value. And this is one of the, I guess, the issues that's facing council is that the former Murray has got a disproportionate amount of the land value of the new council, and that impacts on the options when it comes to the options analysis, which basically means that the former Murray guys will probably have to pay a little bit more than they have done in the past in total, simply because the amount of the land value. In terms of council's rate revenue, this is the new Murray rates. New Murray River Council, you can see farmland provide 54%, residential 37%, and business 9%. And when you compare that to land value, it's pretty close in reality. Land value 51%, 41%, and 8%. So there's a bit of a mismatch between land value and the amount of rates paid, but that's just for comparative purposes only. The next one is the gap, if you like, in the average residential rates. Now, please don't rely on average well, we won't be relying on averages going forward. This is just to help us understand where the potential issues are. So what this is saying is that on average, the residential rate would need, for the former Warcool, would need to go up by 105, and for Murray River, it would need to come down by 55. That's on average, but because you've got a bunch of subcategories, it's not as straightforward as that, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. For business, you can see here the Warcool on average would need to come down by 119, and Murray would need to go up, to equal the average ratepayers. So that's highlighting an issue there for us that there's going to be a bit of a challenge in business rates area. And then farmland, you can see that the former Warcool, the rates would need to come down by 600, and the former Murray, they would need to go up by 560. Again, on average, again suggesting to us that there's going to be a movement of rates income from the former Warcool to Murray, to the previous Murray River Council. So I want to now talk about rates benefit analysis. So what we now do is just try and align the rates paid to the benefits received. And that's trying to, using the principles around community service obligation and transparent funding. So in terms of rates benefits, some ratepayers have more access to make more use of and benefit more from different council services. So if I use a swimming pool, for example, in Moama, those people in Moama would have more access to it, probably would use it more, and therefore would benefit more from it than, say, the rural and farmland people that might be 50, 100 or 200 kilometres away. That's the principle of what we're doing here. So it is somewhat subjective, but we've used it in a number of councils now, and one council in particular is using it to adjust their rates income between categories. The allocation methodology has two criteria. One is a direct beneficiary of the service, which if I use sale yards, if council had some sale yards, the direct beneficiary of those would be farmers and probably the business people, not so much the residential. So that's that principle. And the other one, the council-wide one, is where it's the admin or corporate costs that where there's no direct beneficiary. It just needs to be in place for the council to run. Now, these are the assumptions we've used, and we've allocated the service costs across all these categories. So this information is with council staff and they'll review it, but it's the principle upon which we allocate service costs as a benefit to the categories of council, rating categories of council. So what we end up with is the rates income allocated here. So currently council levies $10.5 million, and these are the proposed categories and subcategories we're using. And basically what it's saying is residential ratepayers are paying, say urban are paying $1.8 million, but are achieving or receiving about $3.4 million worth of ratepayer benefits. We equalise this back to the amount of money paid. In rates, the $22.9 million represents the net cost of services provided by council. So you can see here that the residential ratepayers are paying less than the benefits they're getting, or the residential urban are. But when you come down to farmland, you can see farmland are paying more than the benefits they're getting. So, and this is pretty typical of rural councils across New South Wales, that farmers tend to pay more than residential, and business are pretty much aligned. And I believe that's, you know, a lot to do with the history of the rate structure. When you go back quite a number of years, farmers were probably the wealthier, more better to do people, therefore they could afford to pay more, and that's then formed part of the rating structure over many years. The net cost of service piece is what we're trying to show here, is that from the fixed income that council raises through rates, which is the minimums, in council's case the minimums, represents $1.3 million. Yet the net cost of services excluding infrastructure, so the $22 million previously included infrastructure costs, we've now taken those out, is about $8 million. So there's not a strong alignment between the fixed cost and the net cost of services, and you might argue that the probably council needs to collect more through this to make this fairer for some of the ratepayers. Whereas when you look at the rate in the dollar amount, that is the ad valorem, it represents $9.3 million, and the infrastructure cost is $14.4 million. So you can see there that the ad valorem amount is contributing significantly more to the infrastructure cost. So there is possibly an argument to, you know, collect more in the out of the fixed charges, and then that would then make the rating system a bit more equitable in terms of the, you know, who's paying for what part of the service. The other piece of work we've done is the service pricing piece, and this is really trying to understand the full cost and income of each service, determine the cost level of cost recovery for each service, and then align those council's policies and the actual costs of each service. And then the output of that is to provide information and a guide to council to adjust or realign the funding sources for each services. So it also, once you've got the model in place, it also allows councils to then to review the policies and how they apply their policies in terms of setting fees and charges for councils, fees and charges for council into the future. This is the pricing policy matrix. So each fee and charge has is allocated within this, and whether it's a market price or whether it's a marginal, you can see the recovery cost here, or whether it's statutory and you know, the fee is set and there's no chance of recovering any more. So this is an example of, this is not all the services, this is some of the services that we've done the analysis on. So if you look at caravan parks, for example, they got operating revenue of 353 million, operating expenses of 277. So they're recovering 127% of their cost, which you would expect because caravan parks are provided by the private sector. So it's a market price policing. So you would expect that would be where it is. Whereas if you come to say the corporate engineering and overhead piece, the revenue is significantly lower than the operating result, and so the operating expenses. So the cost recovery is much lower, and so each of those services have a different recovery rate. So overall, the current cost of recovery is 39.4%. We've suggested a proposed target of 43.6%, but that's really up to council in terms of how they want to go about reviewing and changing their cost recovery. And that could be in the form of increased fees and charges, or it could be in the form of just improving or investing more in a particular service to change that rate of recovery. This is just a comparison with some councils nearby, and you can see here that Murray River, based on their fees and charges, and this is from the audited statements, they're recovering about 18%, which is on comparison, you know, towards the upper end of other councils. So you'd say Murray River are doing a reasonable job in recovering or setting fees and charges to recover the cost of some of the services that they provide. Now we're going to get into the rating structure. So this is developing up options. But firstly, your current rating structure, you have three categories: residential, business and farmland. In residential, you have 7 categories and subcategories, and you have 6 different minimum rates that range from 358 to 591. For business, you have 13 categories and subcategories and 4 minimums ranging from 95 to 605. And then in farmland, you've currently got 5 categories and subcategories with 2 minimums of 457 and 605. So as I said earlier, in harmonising or bringing these 2 rating structures together into one, we're going to simplify the categories and subcategories, which I'll show you in a moment. But in doing that, there's going to be some anomalies when you start to look at the outputs of the analysis of the new rating structure when we compare the new rating structure in terms of rates paid to the previous rating structure in terms of rates paid. There is a significant anomaly here with business minimums at 95. You'll see when we get to the graph that it goes off the Richter scale. That certainly needs to come up a bit. And as I mentioned earlier, land values in the former Murray Shire are higher than Warcool. Therefore, there will be some movement of ratepayer income between the 2 former councils. So in terms of the rating structure options, we take council's 8,000 odd assessments and drop it into our ratepayer impact model. The outputs are by former council area. We've streamlined the subcategories, which I'll show you in a minute, but there are still three major categories of business, residential and farmland. And as I mentioned earlier, the variations that you will see are largely due to reducing the number of subcategories. So this is what it looks like. So we have residential with 3 subcategories, urban, non-urban and rural, and the same with business of urban, non-urban, but we've got grain sheds, and then farmland, we've got dry, irrigable and intensive. And over here is where we've allocated the former subcategories into the new subcategory area. So you can work out where you were and then where you fit into the revised subcategory. Now, so we've got 4 options to work through. So the first option is an ad valorem and minimum as the fixed amount. We have no special rates. We are using the same percentage yield by category. So what I mean by there is your total rates income is allocated to categories, residential, business and farmland. So we have left the same income in each of those categories as they were previously. So for the simplified subcategories, as I talked about earlier, the minimum for urban is 475, the minimum for non-urban is 468, and for rural 605. For business, urban 500, non-urban 595, and the grain shed 620. And then for the farmland, all the minimums are 620. So what does this mean? So what we got here is the output of option 1, looking at the former Walker residential rates. The key to look at here is the right-hand edge where it shows you the variation in percentage terms, and they are the lines. The 2 lines are, the grey line is the 2016 valuation, where we're comparing your current rates, 1920, to the revised new rating structure that we've got here. And then the black line is the 2019 valuations, comparing it to the rates, your 1920 rates. So, so for Walker residents under this option, you can see at the front end there's a slight increase in the minimum charges, and there's a drop, and then there's a increase. Now this drop is due to the anomalies from the 7 subcategories that you previously had. How we distribute or how we graph this is by percentile. So there are 10 percentile across here. So then we pick the value for each of those percentile and do the comparison. So there is a bit of variation in the Walker rating structure for minimums. Then for the former Murray Shire, you can see here that with the introduction of the new categories, subcategories, and the minimums, you can start to see that there's a slight increase in most of the rates across that spectrum. Now for business, former Walker, you can see here that there's basically not too much of an increase at the front end. There's a bit of an increase in here, mainly due to the 13 subcategories, as you would have thought. And then towards the back end, it drops off. And why it drops off is because the land value is playing a greater role in the calculation of the rates, and because we've joined Warcool and the former Warcool and the Murray River together, we're now looking at the income across those, and as a result, some of that income now has moved to the former Murray council area. So I show you this one, and the reason for that, the major reason for that, is this one here. Remember there was a $95 minimum? Well, that's moved to $457 if I remember rightly. So there's a significant increase in the front end of this graph, mainly because of that $95. But then when you come across here, there are some increases, 10%, and again, they go up in this 40th and 50th percentile, mainly due to the vagaries of your former seven subcategories, and then they drop down and pan out, I think, at around about 5%. So that's the minimums for the minimum options for business. Now to farmland. So what we're seeing here is that there is a decrease in the Warcool farmland rates, and that's simply because of the proportion of land value when you bring the two former rating structures together. So Murray River is paying proportionally more in income because of their higher land values. So that's what it looks like with the minimums for Warcool, and for the former Murray, it looks like this. So you can now see where that increase has now come into that decrease at Warcool is now come into the former Murray farmland area. And you can see that there's some significant increases in that, right across the spectrum. The second option is ad valorem and base amount. So this is where we can collect up to 50% of the income for any category through a base amount by setting a base amount. So what we've said for this analysis is for the business category, we're modelling 45% of the business income coming through the base amount, residential 45%, and farmland 12.5%. Remember, we're using the same income yield that's currently in place, and we're using the same subcategories that we identified, but you can now see that the base amount for this different subcategories are 318 for urban, 433 for non-urban, and 367 for rural, and business 514, 260, and 1,800, and 330, 854, and 440. So those amounts apply to every single rating assessment, whereas in the minimums, they only apply to those land values where when you multiply the land value by the rate in the dollar, if that amount is less than the minimum, you charge the minimum. Otherwise, you just solely use the ad valorem or rate in the dollar. What the base amount does is it provides a more equitable system, because more of the rate is a fixed rate. Everyone's paying the same amount. Therefore, the rate in the dollar or ad valorem goes down. So it plays a lesser role or has a lesser impact on the calculation of rates. So if we start here, so if we look at Warcool as the former Warcool, you can see here that the base amount, even though there's some reduction at the front end, through the back end in the middle stages, it starts to increase slightly. Again, there's some anomalies because of your subcategories, but 7.5% and 5% through here. Again, there's some anomalies there. So, and then again towards the back end, because the land value is higher, the rates start to move down, and some of that moves off to Murray River as well. For Murray River, under the base amount option, you can see here that again at the front end there's a reduction, but through the middle here there's more of an increase and a more, I guess, a more even distribution when you look at the bars as opposed to the lines. And again, the decrease at the back end is a combination of readjustment of the income, but also people paying more through the base amount than they have in the past. So that's the base amount for residential. Now for business, for the former war cool, significant reductions up front because there were higher minimums and lower base amounts, so you would expect that. And then through the middle here, there's a significant increase in these areas because they're now starting to pay their, if I can put it, their share, a more equitable share of the rates for these land values. And then towards the end, there's a bit of a kick up because there's really high land values there in the last little bit. For Murray River, the former Murray, again, you'll see a similar at the front end, this $95, so quite a number of ratepayers will get an increase there if you adopt this model, and that means more people are paying their fair share at the front end. And again, this is what this grey graph is representing, is that these guys are paying more of their share, and towards the back end they're starting to come off because the front end people have picked up more of the income. Now for farmland, under this model, for Walcool, remember 15%. Again, at the front end, there is a slight increase, 2.5%. And then as you move across, it slowly decreases. And no matter, because of the size of the land value, the amount of size of the land value in farmland, there's still this redistribution of rates income between the former Walcool and Murray councils. And then for Murray, what we've got here is, again, at the front end, there's more people paying a bit more. And then as you move across, it's not anywhere near as high as the minimum. It's more evenly distributed across those percentiles. So, when I look at that, I go, well, that seems to be a fairer model for, a fair approach for farmland for the former Murray. So they're the two key options. The third option and the fourth option, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. And the reason for that is that what we've done is simply moved 3% of the income from farmland to residential. That represents about $300,000. And the reason we did that was because, if you recall, in the rates benefit model, it indicated the farmland were paying a little bit more than the benefits received, and residential, were paying a little bit less. Basically, it just means that the graphs in 3 and 4 are similar shapes to 1 and 2, except they're slightly higher and slightly lower. So as an example, here is option 3 for ad valorem and base amount. So you can see there, if you recall, that's very similar to this one here. So this is the Walcool under option 2 base amount. So you can see the shape there. So that's option 2, and for option 3, it's just slightly increased. So, and again, if you wanted to look at option 3 for Murray, again, it's the same shape, only that they're increasing by 3%. So if I just quickly do that I know you might not be following, but the gist is that the shape is still the same. So I'm not planning to spend any more time on options 3 and 4, mainly because you need, it's about just moving income between categories. Council may or may not choose to do that, and that'll be up to those guys. So really, that's the 3 options, and I understand now Council will be taking this presentation and sharing it with you guys out there in the community. So thank you and good luck with your deliberations and considerations of your rates harmonisation approach.